And hello, good evening, welcome. I'm Mark Pinto, Adult Services Director here at Phoenixville Public Library. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's special Women's History Month presentation featuring author Janis Robinson Daly, who comes to us from Massachusetts tonight and is here with us tonight. Her new novel is The Unlocked Path, whose protagonist is a female medical doctor inspired by actual students of Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. We're delighted to have Janis with us tonight to talk more about her book and about how her own genealogy research inspired her to write it. Please welcome Janis.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Oh,
Mark.
folks
Yes.
on Zoom, keep yourselves muted. We will give you the opportunity at the end to ask questions, and at that time you'll be able to type stuff into the chat. Okay?
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be here in Phoenixville, back in Pennsylvania, where I have some family roots, which I will speak to you about tonight. But the way I'd like to get started is to let you know I've got about a 25-minute PowerPoint, and then happy to take questions throughout. But really kind of excited to share, for so many people, we're just chatting about genealogy. And it was through some genealogy research I was doing that I discovered a link to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And what then inspired me to write my debut novel, The Unlocked Path. So everybody on Zoom can see the screen now too as well, so all right. So there are two people on the screen that I'll introduce you to. The first, on the right, this woman with the red hair, is my grandmother Robinson, whom I never met. She died before I was born. But I always felt a kinship to her. She had that beautiful red hair, and once upon a time I had red hair. Now mine comes from a salon on Cape Cod. But she also had two older brothers and two sons. I have two older brothers and two sons. So I was always just intrigued by her life. And I didn't know a lot about her. Unfortunately, I didn't ask a lot about her of my dad before he passed, and I was 29 when he passed. So, but there were a lot of mysteries. How did she come from growing up in Philadelphia and she moved to Boston? Why? She got married at the ripe old age of 32, an old maid for her time. So there were just questions that I felt like I wanted to explore, because I already knew my mom's side of the family's history, came from Scotland to Boston, hated the city, went to Nova Scotia. Next couple of generations finally came back to Boston. My dad's father, the Robinsons, I knew a lot about them as well. But it was my grandmother, Eliza Pearson Edwards Robinson, who I wanted to investigate. So as my sons were getting ready to graduate college, and kind of odd that we grew up outside of Boston, raised my family outside of Boston. Both my sons went to school in Pennsylvania. They must have had a hidden desire to return to their roots as well. So my younger son was at Franklin and Marshall and played football. So we were still really involved, you know, just coming bound from Massachusetts every fall weekend for football. And as he was getting ready to graduate, I was like, oh, now what am I going to do? I'm going to have all this extra time on my hands, even though I still work full time. So I decided, instead of picking up a golf club or a pickleball racket and getting active, that I'm going to do some genealogy research where I can stay seated in a chair and see what I can learn. So it was through starting to look into my grandmother that I met this gentleman on the left, who was her grandfather. So my great-great-grandfather, William Shannon Pierce. And it was his story that really got me started into writing the book. So what did, let's see, push the right button here.
Hit down button. Yeah.
Down button.
Point it at the laptop.
No. Down, come on, down button. Again, need to be closer. No?
Don't you love technology?
Technology, sorry Zoom folks.
Trying to advance the slide here, and somehow
Well, can we use the space bar? I can just hit the space
Well,
bar.
I don't know whether that's going to work either, so.
Oh.
Oh, interesting. Oh, no, let's see. Ah,
What did you do?
Oh, there we go.
I don't know.
Well, stay up here, I might need you because I've got 25 more slides. Okay, so what did I know about my grandmother? I did know that she was from Philadelphia. She was a debutante, born in 1879, and I knew that her grandfather was a judge. And I actually loved the name Pierce, the family name, his name. My oldest son is named James Pierce for him. But how did she get to Boston, where she met my grandfather, Eliza Robinson, married as an old maid, and then immediately had her 2 sons?
What's the date that, oh, I'm
Okay,
sorry, what was the
sorry.
date that was covered up there by the Zoom
she was
screen?
born in 1879.
Okay, thanks.
So that portrait that I just showed you, and that was on the first slide as well, that was the only picture I had of her that my dad gave to me. Until another piece of genealogy research, if you're cleaning out a family home, go through every closet, every drawer, every box, everything. You don't know what you might find. As I found this photo of my dad's parents in a little box in his top bureau drawer. So when I was tasked with cleaning out the family home, I found this photo. Again, it was the only photo of them. And it was inscribed on the back, now touring the southern states. So given the age of the dress that she's in and his boater hat, I'm thinking it must have been their honeymoon in 1912. Okay. And then they separated when her children were quite young. And I did know that. I did know that my grandparents separated. Didn't know the full reasons. But certainly, divorce was taboo back then. A woman could lose a lot. She could lose her home. She could lose her children if she didn't have, proper legal counsel and all. So they were separated for almost 20 years until they did divorce pretty much the day after my dad graduated college in 1936. So I'm thinking she wanted to make sure that his college tuition bills were paid for. And then, as I said, she passed before I was born in 1957. So when I started my research, thank goodness for Google. Before Google, I don't know how people did half the research or 3/4 of the research. So, again, I knew a lot about my grandfather Robinson because he was almost a Renaissance man of his times. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer. He was an artist. He had beautiful watercolors and oil paintings, and my brothers and I all have some of them in our homes. He was a tennis player. He was a golfer. He sang in the choir at his church. He even wrote some music. My brother just found some of his sheet music that he wrote. So, a very talented man. And he was a romance novelist. So maybe there was another little hidden gene somewhere in the family. So I found this article about the book that he published in 1916, Man Proposes. And I found that article because when I was researching my grandmother, her name's included in the article. That he married Elizabeth Pierce Elliott, they spelled the Pierce wrong, got the Elliott right, formerly of Philadelphia, the daughter of an English banker, Adolphus Elliott. That was kind of boring. But it did mention that she was this granddaughter of a Judge Pierce. And this was then the first time I saw that he was not only a judge, he was involved in the abolitionist movement here in Philadelphia. So if any of you have read The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd, it is about Sarah and Angelica Grimke that come from Charleston to Philadelphia and get involved in the abolitionist movement. So I've always been fascinated by that history, and then to learn that one of my ancestors was involved, I said, oh, I can't find anything else about this, my grandmother. She never worked outside the home. She wasn't apparently involved in anything that would have gotten her into a Google search besides this. So I thought, I'm going to check more into this Judge Pierce and see what I can learn about him. So, I found he was much more than just a judge. He was an incredibly well-educated, talented man. This photo here, and I mention it from my Pennsylvania tour groups, because this portrait is on file. I was able to find it online. It's at the Hollis Law Library now at Harvard, but it was commissioned as a portrait for the 1876 Centennial Exhibition here in Philadelphia.
Oh, wow.
They had put together, they had commissioned portraits of famous Americans, particularly Philadelphians. So that's where I first got to meet the judge. But that's where I also learned that he was involved in the abolitionist movement. He actually was the defense counsel for almost every runaway slave case that came before the courts in Philadelphia in the 1850s. So under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, runaway slaves who were captured were tried and most often were sent back to the South and to their owners. But he took up the defense of those slaves and won almost every case. So I am now thinking, well, I'm truly honored to know that such a man is in my family history. Some more research. I did come down and did a trip to Philadelphia. I went to Laurel Hill Cemetery, and that's where the family gravestone is, and you know, a pretty large area because there are several burials there, several markers. And also through the Philadelphia City Records, I could see, and this is just great resources, anybody doing the city records, census records. They lived at 1710 Race Street, which prominent address. It looks out, of course, to the Art Museum. It's at that end of Race Street. Unfortunately, that building's gone. It's the United Way building now. But at least I was able to like stand right where the house had been. But I was able to see that they had 7 daughters and 1 son. And then there were 3 more children listed on the gravestones that died in infancy. So my great-great-grandmother bore 10 children. So 7 daughters and 1 son, George, God bless him. I think he was right in the middle of all those sisters.
Poor kid.
I know. And then another piece of information, and these were in writings, many of them that I found at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in downtown Philadelphia. When I put in a request, they pulled a whole file of different articles and mentions of William Pierce, and obituaries, eulogies that were given at his death. So another one mentioned that he would take great delight in discussing various phrases of the Old Testament, with which he was very familiar. So at first I thought maybe he was a Quaker, being involved in the abolitionist movement, but more records show I think they were Presbyterian, so some of the marriage certificates. And actually right on his gravestone, under his name, and I'm not a student of the Bible, but he has an inscription from Song of Solomon 2:17 that reads, "Until the day dawns and the shadows flee away." And I made note of that, and the sentiment of brushing away the shadows, and the shadows of our history, and having a new day dawn on discovery. So it was a theme that I then brought into the book. Another mention in one of his eulogies by one of his friends and co-counsels, his daughters were women of character and intellectual training. Now, how often did you hear women spoken about in the 1870s in that manner? So he was obviously a man that believed in the rights of others. He believed in the freedom of the slave that he was defending and trying to win their freedom. He believed in educating women. And that was the final line I found in Famous Americans' entry about him. He took an active part in founding the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Okay. Hold on a minute. Now, you folks are you're all from Philadelphia area pretty much, or? Jean, where are
We
you
were
from?
born in Philly.
Originally.
Iowa.
Iowa, okay. Did you know about women's medical?
Oh, yeah.
You did.
Our
That's
dad-
right. You said
Our dad
your
worked
dad worked there.
Mhm.
Okay. So I grew up outside of Boston, and there was a women's medical college eventually in Boston as well. But the one in Philadelphia was the first, founded in 1850. It was the first to award accredited degrees. And that was the difference. You know, women have been healers and midwives forever, but it was earning that accredited degree, gaining that education that they all, you know, sought, but there was no place for them to go because so many of the male colleges denied them admission. There were a few select women that got into some smaller schools. I mean, Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to earn a medical degree in the U.S., but she went to a very small college in upstate New York, in Geneva. She certainly didn't go to Penn or Harvard or Yale Medical. But women's medical opened in 1850. It had 3 different locations in Philadelphia, started on Arch Street, moved to North College Avenue until its final destination, 1300 Henry Avenue by Drexel, where it ended up. They admitted men in 1970, so they were also the longest running women's only medical school, 170 years, and then they fully merged with Drexel. As recently as 2014, the final merger documents were finished. So, I went to a women's college myself. At the time, Wheaton College in Massachusetts was all women, and I knew immediately that the students that must have gone to this women's medical college would have had the same relationships and the same supportive environment and an incredible sisterhood that really develops among the students and the staff and the alumni. And so, you know, I paused and I thought, you know what, those women that went to that medical school really must have been amazing, to fought for, you know, following their desire and their calling to study medicine. So I decided, I'm gonna write a book. Enough with the genealogy research. I've read a ton of historical fiction. I've been in book clubs for almost 25 years, and we read a lot of historical fiction, and I had never heard of early women doctors. So, as we like to say in historical fiction, author arena, down the rabbit hole I went for more research. And the first woman I discovered, because her name comes up very high when you start to search about the graduates of this school, famous graduates. Anna Dabai Gopal Joshi was the first woman from India to earn a Western medical degree. And it was meeting Anna Dabai that totally sealed the deal for me that I was going to write this book. And her story is nothing less than amazing. She came from one of the upper castes in India, married through an arranged marriage at the age of 9 to a man 20 years older than her. Had her first child when she was 14 and then lost him within days to tuberculosis. And she's barely a child herself at 14. And, you know, completely overcome by the grief, of course, of losing a child, her first child. And she took that grief and she turned it into anger. And she turned it into purpose, that she wanted to study medicine. Because she felt like there was a lack of care for herself and for her son and for so many other women, either just a general lack of care or a mistrust of the male doctors. So she was very, very fortunate that the husband, 20 years older than her, who you would think would be extremely traditional and arranged marriage and everything, he supported her decision to want to go study medicine. And so together they researched and they found Women's Med and found a sponsor to advocate for her admission. So she entered in 1884. It was a 2-year program in the 1800s, 1880s. So another piece you find when you're researching Anna Dabai is actually her admissions letter, her kind of essay that she sends seeking admission. And again, it was her words that just blew me away. And I felt like I needed to bring the sentiment of her words forward in the book. So I'll read it in part for you, which is, "The determination which has brought me to your country against the combined opposition of my friends and caste ought to go a long way towards helping me to carry out the purpose for which I came, i.e. is to render to my poor suffering countrywomen the true medical aid they so sadly stand in need of, in which they would rather die than accept at the hands of a male physician. The voice of humanity is with me, and I must not fail. My soul is moved to help the many who cannot help themselves." 17 years old, writing these words. I was just like, oh, Anna Dubai. How many more out there like you that went to this women's medical college, and so many others that had that calling to care for others, and how could they accomplish that? So I now have the idea for a book, and I have the subject, I've got inspiration for my characters, I've got the setting, but the one piece I'm missing is the time period I'm going to cover. So I certainly could have written the book, you know, at the founding of the school in 1850, and kind of gotten into the real history that way. I could have placed it exactly when Anna Dubai was here in Philadelphia in the 1880s. But I went back to how I got started on this journey, and that was my grandmother. If I hadn't started looking into her, I never would have set out on this path. So I decided to peg the story to the timeline of her life, which would be coming of age, being a debutante in Philadelphia in 1897, becoming a young woman at the turn of the century, becoming a bride in 1912, and then having her 2 children by 1914. Now, full disclosure, my grandmother never went to medical college. Again, I couldn't find much about her at all, but I decided that because I never knew her full story, that I would create one. So my main character, Eliza, is inspired by some of the events and some of the timeline of my grandmother's life. So now I'm going to write a book. Well, how am I going to do this? I've worked in sales and marketing for almost over 35 years, so a lot of business writing, strategic writing in that manner, but not creative writing. Maybe class in high school, maybe one in college, I can't even remember. So I did take an online creative writing class, which was very helpful. And then I knew I had to do a lot of research. If this was going to be historical fiction, I still needed to do a lot of research. So turned to books, and was very fortunate that there are quite a few nonfiction books I was able to find on women in medicine from the 1800s and early 1900s. The bottom one, A New and Untried Course by Dr. Stephen Pietzman, is all about the Women's Medical College, and he's still here in the Philadelphia area. So lots of note cards. I'm still old school. I got my little note cards, all classified and color-coded, different things. But also fiction, because I'm writing fiction. What would inspire me to think about and themes that I want to explore? So one of my book club's first books that we read was Anita Diamant's The Red Tent. And if anyone has read it, or if you haven't, it's set in biblical times. So what would that have to do with writing about women in medicine? Well, it talks all about that strong community of women. So women coming together for a few days, once a month, in a tent together. But it's, this sisterhood that develops, and, supporting each other through life's trials and triumphs. If you haven't read it, for anybody from the Philadelphia or lives in the Philadelphia area, As Bright as Heaven by Susan Meissner, who is one of my all-time favorite historical fiction authors. It's set in Philadelphia during the Spanish flu. So I knew Susan's writing, and I trusted her that she had done her research about what the Spanish flu looked like in Philadelphia, so I draw information and inspiration from that. And then, what would my characters be influenced by? What would be contemporary to their time? So, The Awakening by Kate Chopin was published in 1897, and it's one of the first explorations of a term that was coming into vogue at that time, of a new woman. So it's about a woman who is awakening her own independent desires and her desires to be educated, her intellectual ability that she knows she has and has been, smothered really. The main character, Edna Pompier, from set in Louisiana, she's just kind of like a fluff wife. She just walks around in her Victorian era clothing and all, and she finally gets like fed up. Like, there's gonna be more to my life than just being this show wife. And she also has an awakening of her own sexual desires. So 1897 was scandalous. Ooh. But now, this is really a classic and is considered to be a precursor to modern feminist theory that people point to. And then, of course, I had to read some of my grandfather's books, but they were published, right in those early teens of 1910s. So what did dialogue look like? If he was writing contemporary, it was a much more formal language back then. So how would my characters talk and converse? And what were they wearing? And just the kind of that interaction to build relationships. So I did read a few of his, including Man Proposes, which is set in Newport, the tennis set. So anyone that has read the book, you'll see where the inspiration for a chapter in Newport comes from. Okay, so I've done a lot of reading, which is passive. So now I really needed to see and touch and learn as much as I could, and was very fortunate when I did come to Philadelphia to plan a day at Drexel. So when the schools merged, Drexel inherited all of the archival materials from Women's Medical. And Matt Herbison over at the archives set me up in one of their basement rooms, like pulled a full cart out of this incredible materials. So everything from photographs to a matriculation ticket that you had to present. You had to pay $5 for it, but it allowed you entrance on the first day of school, that you had been admitted, that you had passed the entrance exam that was considered to be harder than Penn or Jefferson. Correspondence from the admissions office, and continued correspondence with the dean, some of the meeting minute notes and alumni notes, the expense sheet from 1897. Anyone want to guess what tuition would have been?
Not much. Well, by today's standards anyway.
Yeah, $135. So I think we've had some inflation since then. God help anyone who's paying tuition bills now. But of course then you had all those little hidden fees they never tell you about. Things like 50 cents to use the library, the reading room at the college. Things like rental of your bone box. So this was pretty cool. Matt brought out this box and opened it and explained to me that in the late 1800s, each student had to rent a box of bones for anatomy class. They each got a skull, and then about 12 to 15 bones that between the 40 students, they could assemble 2 full skeletons.
Oh, wow.
And then you had to return your box at the end of the semester, and if inventory was complete, then you got 80% of your $5 back. So I'll just share real quick, I was giving this presentation at a library outside of Boston in December, and a woman came in with her mother. Mother was quite elderly, but she said to me, I have to bring my mom. She graduated from Women's Medical in 1962.
Oh my gosh.
And she was amazing, Dr. Linda McFarland. She, when I get to this slide and I'm talking about the bone box, she's like, oh my goodness! I'm like, what's the matter? I had a bone box in 1960.
That's so
They were
cool.
still using it. She goes, and she was smaller than me, which Zoom people, I'm only 5'2". And she goes, and I had the femur. So my box was like this big, and I had to walk around the campus with it.
Oh, that's
She was just delightful.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was a true pleasure to meet her. And, she went on to tell me that she had a career as an anesthesiologist at Columbia Presbyterian in New York.
Wow.
And when she retired in the early 2000s, she mentioned one of the last surgeries that she was anesthesiologist for. The only man in the room was the patient.
Wow.
So we've
Wow.
come a long way, which was really cool to hear. And I'm so lucky to have met her and have her share her stories. So one of the last pieces that Matt brought out were the meeting minute books from the Board of Corporators and Trustees. And, jump back just a moment of how I got started on this was great-great-grandfather, Judge Pierce, was a founder, but I didn't know what that meant. He could have been a benefactor. I mean, certainly he lived at a very prominent address, must have had a few dollars in his pocket. But I started to open the book and trying to read, the hand scripted meeting minutes, and realized that the first 6 years were all signed by William S. Pierce, the
Wow.
Secretary of the Board.
Wow.
So I am now holding, gloved hands to touch these books in my hand that my great-great-grandfather had transcribed in his hand.
That's so
And
special.
just another plug for go through those closets and drawers and everything. There was a letter accompanying these books from the judge's son, George, that when cleaning out his father's office, he found all these meeting minute books and he felt that he should donate them to the college. So that was pretty cool. Okay, so I've done all my research possible. I've got inspiration, I've got all the facts, I've got ideas. But now I'm really starting to think about character development, which for fiction is what really makes the story more compelling, is develop a well-developed character. And I'm thinking, I need to talk to some women in medicine before I get too far down the road here. So I interviewed some women medical students, and I found on social media an Instagram account, Women in Medicine. And it's just mostly students in medical school, women, who just are sharing posts of like tips for note-taking or studying, or this is so hard, I'm never going to make it, or this is what I achieved. And so they're just sharing information. And I'll just share a couple that I pulled out because I felt like some of their sentiments, even today, would have been the same back in 1900. So the one on the left says, maybe she was born with it. Maybe it's hard work, determination, challenging her limits, getting knocked down, getting back up, ignoring her doubters, investing in herself, asking for help, and never giving up. So that was what I was feeling, that's what a medical student needs. They need to live by that mantra. And of course, the care and compassion that they have for their patients. And then I love this one from Dr. Samantha Bat-Rowden. It happened, it finally happened. A man talked down to me about my specialty. He quoted a paper. I wrote the damn paper. Small victories. So somebody then goes on to say, well, I hope you told him that you wrote the paper. Oh, you damn right I did. And he was mortified and apologized. So yes, small victories. We're getting there. So when I the book is set in the turn of the century. Only about 5% of all doctors were women. And today, 51% of our medical students are women. So they're coming into the profession. I also love this one. Woman posted, of course, when they're getting matched for their residencies after college, and she's holding up her sign, and her husband is so proud of her. He's the trophy husband. And I just love that one too, that, really does show a little bit of how far, luckily, we have come. But as Dr. Bat Robin points out, well, we still have a ways to go too. Okay, I've written a book. It's only taken me 3 years. Research and writing and editing and feedback and rewriting and redrafting and all that. And the end is typed December 2019. And now I need to get ready to look to find an agent or publisher, because I really wanted to go that route instead of self-publishing. So now I've got a whole other research project of trying to find who's going to be a good fit for this book. So the largest publishers won't even look at you without an agent. So the first place you have to start is finding an agent. So I'm starting to put together a list of, well, who's Susan Meissner's agent, and other historical fiction authors that might be interested in my book. So I'm starting to compile my list, and I'm working on my query letter, that is your pitch to agents, that in like 3 lines you have to get them excited about your whole book. And then in January, while I'm doing this, another book is published, American Dog.
Somebody gave me that to read.
So
I haven't read it.
I haven't read it yet.
If you are or aren't familiar with it, if you haven't read it, it's a contemporary fiction about a woman fleeing Acapulco, Mexico, from the drug cartels, and her journey coming north with her son to cross the border. So you're thinking, what in the world would this book have to do about women in medicine, historical fiction? Although I would like to see Oprah's book club decal on my front cover someday. It was actually the controversies that came out after the book published. Even though it was an Oprah's pick, Janine Cummings, the author, was accused of cultural appropriations. What gave her the right, as a non-Hispanic white woman, to write the experiences of this Latina woman from Mexico? How could she be authentic to her perspective? Even though Janine had gone to the border, she had interviewed women on both sides of the border, she had gone to Acapulco, she had done her research, as any author will do, about any of the subjects or settings that they're writing about, not just historical fiction. I was fortunate because by this time now, we're all in lockdown, but we're learning how to use Zoom. So I saw Janine speak. My local bookstore hosted her over Zoom, and I mean, she was even saying she was getting death threats because people were so irate that she had published this book. And she did point out, I wrote the book. I think I did a good job, and she does claim that she does have some Puerto Rican lineage, but that she doesn't fully identify as Latina. But it was my publisher who chose to publish my book, not one written by somebody else, by a Latina voice. So again, why would this give me any pause to question anything about my book? Well, it's because I have no background in medicine. I barely passed my Bio 101 class in college. But I had a friend in a writing group who's an ER doctor, and I did have him read my medical scenes to make sure I was accurate with that. And if you haven't read the book, don't worry, there's nothing really too gory or anything in the medical scenes. But I was like, well, am I being authentic to a woman in medicine and their inner feelings and emotions and responses to situations? So I decided, because of this controversy and now the heightened awareness by publishers of authors writing from a point of view that they are not personally identify as, I felt that I needed a woman in medicine to read my book. And I didn't know any women doctors. Not some well enough that I could say, hey, I have 90,000 words here in a manuscript, and I have no writing background. Would you read my book and give me feedback? So, working in sales, I had one of the best bosses I ever had when I actually worked at the Walt Disney Company. Just always taught us, swing for the fences. Just go for it. You'll never know. You've got everything to gain, nothing to lose. So I did. And I sent an email to the American Medical Women's Association that I found online, thinking maybe they'll have a woman that would be interested, in their membership directory that might be interested in reading my manuscript. So I just sent it to info@ and said what I was looking for. And it was another good 6 to 8 weeks of crickets on my inbox until finally I got a response from Dr. Eliza Pearson, executive director. I love the idea of your book. Send me your manuscript. I will read it. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I immediately sent it off to her. I said, I didn't give her any timeline. I was like, if this woman is going to take time out of her day or night as a practicing physician, mother to 3, an executive director of this national association, she can have all the time in the world. So she came back to me probably within about 6 weeks, and she gave me feedback, and most importantly, she gave me that validation and endorsement that I could then point to, and I've included her words in the front of the book too. But when I'm talking to agents and publishers, I can say, one of the top women in medicine has read the book and agreed that I've done a good job. So I am forever indebted to Dr. Chin. The association is going to have their annual meeting in Philadelphia in 3 weeks, and I'm actually going to do a Zoom chat with Dr. Chin beforehand for their membership. We're going to talk about the parallels of history then and now of women in medicine.
Isn't the main character Eliza?
Okay, so
No, Eliza's named after her.
I am going to read a quick passage from the book because I think it summarizes, a medical scene, but also what these women went through, what was expected of them, and that sisterhood, as well as, a new day awakening. So we are in a operating theater, and this scene and experience came from some of my research. Dr. Mary Bennett Ritter, that went to the medical school, she wrote about her experience, so then I've taken it and fictionalized it a little bit. So the women of Women's Med have been told that they're going to be observing a surgery, but men from Jefferson Medical are going to be in the room with them. So the one of my characters, to my main character Eliza, her classmate Edith, before the women go into the operating theater, says to the collection around her, "We need to watch each other too. If you see anyone wavering, pinch her or something. We can't give these Jefferson blockheads any fodder to think we don't belong in the operating room as much as they do." Down the line in domino fashion, every women's med student took up the woman's hand on either side of her. They trained their eyes forward to the table, following the lamp's lighted path. The first incision started below the inner edge of the patient's eye and continued along the nose line to his lip. A wave of nausea enveloped Eliza. She gritted her teeth as she felt her body sway. Averting her eyes from the table, she watched a Jefferson man slump to the floor. She turned back to the surgery, unfolding before her. One of the surgical residents peeled back a flap of skin as Dr. Palmer snipped the tendons. Eliza gripped Edith's and Olga's hands tighter. They returned the pressure. Another Jefferson student dropped. Out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed an ashen pallor creep across Olga's face as her grip weakened. Eliza pinched the fleshy underpart of Olga's forearm. "Ow!" Olga exclaimed. Eliza ignored the cry. The blood returned to Olga's face. By the end of the surgery, beneath their jacket sleeves, bruises and welts from pinches and crescent moon-shaped imprints from fingernails appeared as medals of valor. The gusty mid-December air brought cooler temperatures for the evening. The women leaned into each other, drawing upon the warmth of sisterly friendship and strength. In 16 days, a new year, a new decade, and a new century would dawn. 1900 promised possibilities. Eliza and her classmates would define a new woman. Independent women who strove for more and achieved more. They would become doctors. An enlightened century of medicine would emerge. The time had arrived.
That's great.
So, thank you. From a single line, if found in an obituary, came the idea and inspiration
Oh, look
for a
at
book. So I like to just leave folks with the idea that genealogy research is fascinating, and you never know what you might find. You don't have to write a book, but think of the hidden treasures that you can share with your family and pass along. You know, now I can share with my son Pierce information about his namesake, and with both my boys and my daughter-in-law and all, and one day, maybe grandchildren, just amazing pieces of information. Now, you may also find folks that you don't want to claim or your ancestors in there too, but for the most part, I mean, I just found it fascinating. And the other thing too is ask the questions of the older generations that are still with us. You know, I never asked my dad about his mother, about his family. What did he know about the Pierces and Elliots of Philadelphia? How did they get from Philadelphia to Boston? And I regret that. So I'm very fortunate I was able to learn what I did, but ask the questions and share the information. So we are starting Women's History Month for the month of March. And I've had a lot of fun. I've put together this curated list of 31 titles to read. And the library here in Phoenixville has a display. They've pulled many of the books that they have in circulation. It's up in the adult fiction area. This list is available on my website. But it's all historical fiction, and it's every book. I have a few pieces of criteria picking them. I wanted historical fiction, so not biographies. I think historical fiction reaches a wider audience, more readers will pick up historical fiction. Women authors only, because I want to celebrate women. I wanted diversity both in the author as well as the subject matter, and that diversity was not just cultural, but also setting and time period and what industry or area of accomplishments she was noted for. So we have everything from World War I, women from Smith College who go to World War I and serve to help the French civilians, to the suffragists, to the women divers of Jeju Island and Island of Sea Women by Lisa C., to Sumon Kids. Of course, Unlocked Path is on there. Just fabulous books. If you're following me on social media, you're seeing I'm featuring one book every single day. I've also, at 7 o'clock on automatic posting, I'm doing a trivia contest every night at 7 o'clock, learn more about women in history. So we're having some fun there. And I've got a lot of the authors who are also promoting this list. And again, it can be found on my website, just Janis with an S. Anybody on Zoom or in the room that couldn't remember Janis Joplin, so not that she's my namesake, my parents were not that cool. And then the R for Robinson, and Daly is also the short version. I also have a newsletter. I know some of the folks here get my newsletter. You can sign up for that. And if you haven't read The Unlocked Path yet, it is available here at Phoenixville, sitting up in the display, so anybody can grab it tomorrow or tonight. And it's also available from Amazon, ebook from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Audible version came out in November. And I'm really excited. The narrator did a fabulous job. I'm really very, very happy with the job Patricia Shea did. Or if you want to purchase a copy from your independent bookstore, they can order it for you. So, any questions? Anybody in the room or on Zoom have any questions that I can answer?
Is it your main character, Eliza?
Yes.
And the doctor was Eliza?
And so,
Is that like
so
weird?
when she was so sweet, when she responded to my email, she goes, because I told her a little bit about the book, and she said, well, I'm drawn to the story, and it's not just because the main character's name is Eliza, but it did catch my eye. So, no, I
How
chose Eliza
strange.
5 years ago when I started the book because
Yeah.
a form of my grandmother's name, Elizabeth. Yeah, so that was pretty cool, pretty fun.
I really like learning all the information that you included, but I also was thinking, like as I was reading, how far we've come, but how far we have to go
Yeah.
still.
And history can repeat itself.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so and that's what I'm speaking with, this parallels in history that I'm women physicians. So just a couple of quick examples, and I wrote a blog article somewhere, it's posted, but the chapter about the Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I had finished the book in 2019, but then while I'm waiting for a response from American Medical Women's Association, I'm just like this. All of a sudden now I'm living through a pandemic.
Right.
And I'm watching on TV the fear and the exhaustion and the emotional drain of our professionals in medicine. I'm seeing them on TV every night.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm learning how they would come home and quarantine themselves, sleep in a basement or garage to stay away from their family, or put plexiglass up. So I did go back into the Spanish flu chapter and edited that to bring more of that idea in. At one point, Eliza comes home and she doesn't want to go near her children, and her mother's yelling at her, "Get in here and feed your children breakfast." And she's like, I've been exposed to, we don't know what this virus is, and so I did.
And they were being told that, it's nothing,
It's
it's gonna
nothing.
pass. And
It's nothing.
so, yeah.
And then another one parallel that I brought out in my article was, so in the book, I mention one of the real life women who was inspired a character was Charlotte Fairbanks. She was a graduate, 1901, of the medical college, and she went on to become a surgeon and went to France as part of an all-women's hospital unit that went to France in World War I. Volunteered their services. Of course, the U.S. Army at first said, "No, thank you. Don't need you, ladies, over there in the middle of a war." They went anyway, and to take care of the French civilians that were being injured or just having disease. Everyday diseases don't start just because there's a war going on in your backyard. And then a year ago, I'm watching on television in Boston about this woman doctor who had just volunteered to go to Poland for the Ukraine war outbreak and treating the civilians that were fleeing over the border. So, those types of parallels, that are, and so many of the women's health issues that I mentioned in the book, still going on today.
Exactly,
well.
yeah.
Anyone on Zoom with a question or comment, feel free to unmute, or you can type in the chat.
My mom, we were lucky enough to have my mom live with us for 18 years as she got older. And my daughter spent a lot of time with her. And when she was very little, she used to say she only had one sister, it was her Grammy. So she was an only child. But when you talked about stories, she knew stories that she had asked questions about and listened to my mother that I didn't know.
That's wonderful.
And
Wonderful.
one of them was
Gift.
about my grandfather coming home with the Spanish flu,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how he fell into the front door
Oh.
and said to my mother, "Go get a bottle of whiskey." But he survived.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was amazed that my daughter knew this story that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And, and that's because she
Right.
was always asking questions about what did you do when you were little, and you know, so she
Oh, that's
really.
wonderful. What
But
a
asking
gift.
those questions is so
So
important.
important. Yeah. And of course, Philadelphia was the hardest hit city.
Mm-hmm.
Had the highest death rate and all, and they do blame it on a Liberty Loan parade.
The parade, yeah.
That
Yeah.
thousands and thousands just and that the Department of Public Health had said, oh, it's not a problem, don't worry about it, go have the parade, we need that money raised for the Liberty loans.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Denny online has a question. Go ahead, Denny, you can unmute.
Thank you, Janice. This has been great.
Thank you.
And I've been following you on your Facebook. I just
Oh.
happened to talk about the little serendipities that
Yeah.
I saw your 31 days mentioned on the Women's History
Yeah.
site.
Great.
And then since I follow Chester County Library, then I saw your name again, like the same day. It's like, okay, I must be needing to listen to this.
Well, thank you so much. I've got a couple of other social media followers here in person. It's just fabulous.
Yeah, it just was funny how that worked out. But did I see on one of your posts that as you were traveling south to north, did you make a mention that you're working on another book?
Yes, yes. So one of the best pieces of advice I got while I was still in the manuscript phase, I went to a writer's conference. And there were agents and editors there, and we were just supposed to talk about our book. So I'd start talking about my book, set in 1897 to 1957. Follows this woman, through college, into her career and all. And they're like, too long. You cannot do justice to that amount of a time period and the history in that time period. Your book will either need to be 900 pages, and you're an unknown author. No one is going to invest their time in a 900-page book, or the price of what a 900-page book would be these days. So, chop it off at a logical point in your story, and set your readers up for a sequel. So, chopped the book at 1920. And I now do have some chapters that have already been written. I've already had new ideas, though, since then that I'll kind of weave in and out. So working on a sequel that I am going to skip over the 20s because, that was just the Great Gatsby era and everything was roaring and everybody's having a good time. And, of course, we want strife and challenge and despair in our books, so why not pick up in the 1930s Depression? So I'm going to start in the Depression and then go into World War II. And again, anyone that reads historical fiction, there's tons written about World War II set in Europe. But what did World War II look like on the home front? What did it look like for a woman who is a mother to two sons who are of service age, like my dad and uncle, who both served. So we'll kind of explore that, and then also where the unlocked path is more of a coming of age and getting started. What does the other end of the age spectrum? We don't have as many mature characters represented in fiction. And what does that look like for so many of us that have lived through or are living through the newer idea, but an age-old situation of the sandwich generation, caring for an elderly parent and caring for your children or grandchildren. So lots of other themes that I'm excited to explore, as well as, then what were still some of the big health issues of the 30s and 40s. And what did that look like and how did that impact anybody in medicine? So Working on it. Publishing date to be determined. The good news is my publisher, Black Rose Writing, has already said they want, so far, they haven't seen it, but they're very interested in probably publishing the next one too.
That's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Denny.
Thank you. Very fascinating.
All right, anyone else from in person or Zoom?
Great. Well, the rest of the folks on Zoom, feel free to check out my website if you want to sign up for my newsletter. There's a little pop-up box that comes up. You can't miss it. And I do have a monthly newsletter that some of the folks here have subscribed to. And it's not just information about buy my book. It's, you know, I give tips for book clubs because I love book clubs. I give information on what I'm reading and a short review. Personally, and then I always like to spotlight an independent bookstore because I do travel all over the place. So try to fit that in as well.
Well, thanks for
Very
stopping by Phoenixville.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good luck.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Zoom.